constantly insists that Marxism is discredited, outdated, and totally dead and buried, then proceed to build a lucrative career on beating that supposedly dead horse for the rest of your working life. Remember, any unnatural death that occurs under a communist regime is not only attributable to the leaders of the state, but also Marxism as an ideology. Ignore deaths that occur for the same reason in non-communist states. Communism or Marxism is whatever you want it to be. Feel free to label countries, movements, and regimes as communist regardless of things like actual goals, stated ideology, diplomatic relations, economic policy, or property relations. If there was a conflict involving communists, the conflict and all ensuing deaths will be laid at the feet of communism. Be careful when applying this to World War II. Fascist movements who fought against the Soviets or communist partisans are fine, but try not to openly praise Nazi Germany. Save that for private conversations if you must do so. You decide what Marxism really means, and who the rightful representatives of communism were. Feign interest that Trotsky was somehow robbed of power by Stalin, despite the fact that you hate him as well. Constantly talk about George Orwell, quote from Animal Farm or 1984. Do not worry about the fact that Orwell never set a foot in the Soviet Union, and both of those books are novels. Quote massive death tolls without regards to demographics or consistency. 3 million famine deaths, 7 million, 10 million, 100 million deaths total. You need not worry about anyone checking your work, which is good, for you seeing that you haven't done any. Everyone ever arrested under a communist regime was most likely innocent of any crime. Communists only arrested harmless poets and political prophets who had a beautiful message to share with the world. Everything Stalin did or didn't do had some sinister ulterior motive. Everything. Keeping with the spirit of number 9, remember that Stalin was an omnipotent being, perhaps an incarnation of the Hindu deity Vishnu, who had full awareness of everything that was going on in the Soviet Union and total control over every occurrence which took place between 1924 and 1953. Everything that occurred during that time was the will of Stalin. Stalin knew the exact details of every criminal case that took place during that era, and out of his boundless cruelty had tons of innocent people shot for no reason, regardless of where they were or their position in life. Being omnipotent, he was not dependent on information passed up from tens of thousands of subordinates. Constantly attack communist regimes for actions that occur in capitalist regimes up to this very day. Claim that Marxism is utopian because of its description of a possible future society. Alternatively, claim that Marxism failed because it never gave a detailed description of how a communist society would look. Do not pay attention to the massive contradiction here. Start referring to Marxism as being some kind of religious faith, messianic, or some other spiritualist bullshit that you can come up with. When people point out that you can draw similarities between virtually any political ideology and other religions, ignore them. Remember, 1-2 anti-communist attack. Attack the post-Stalin system on economic grounds and claim it just doesn't work. Since an informed opponent will most likely point out the actual socialist economics did indeed work during the Stalinist era, and in fact worked very well. Attack the era on human rights grounds. 2 words, human nature. What is human nature? For your purposes, human nature is a quick explanation why political ideas or systems you don't like are wrong. Bolshevik revolutions were carried out with violence and bloodshed. Bourgeois revolutions were all carried out by democratic reforms, and there was no violence whatsoever. Use words like freedom and democracy constantly. Do not accept any challenge to define these terms. Communists can be for or against whatever is popular in your particular area. If you are preaching to a right-wing crowd, communists are degeneration and homosexuality. If you are preaching to a more mainstream audience, communists were homophobic. Essentially, communists are for moral degeneration and puritanical prudity at the same time. Again, do not notice the contradiction. Constantly flog Stalin over the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement while totally ignoring massive support and collaboration with Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan on the part of America, Britain, and France, long before the war even began and after in some ways. As usual, do not allow your opponent to examine the context of the Non-Aggression Pact. Praise the newfound freedoms of Eastern Europe, ignore the massive depopulation via migration, plunging birth rates, huge alcohol and drug problems, political instability, civil wars, ethnic cleansing, sex trafficking, child prostitution, organized crime, high suicide rates, unemployment, disease, etc. Who cares about all that when you have freedom of speech? Constantly talk about the culture of fear in communist nations, about that knock on the door in the middle of the night, ignore the kick in your door in the middle of the night, stick a shotgun in your back and haul your ass out of bed, etc., because you are suspected of dealing, a normal occurrence in the American war on drugs. Attack communists for suppression of religion, attack Islamic fundamentalists for not being secular. What contradiction? Do not notice the irony that the U.S. is currently fighting an incredibly expensive losing war against an opponent which it funded, supported, and even handed its first victory in Afghanistan. What should you say when confronted with all the continuing and often worsening problems in the world today and are asked for a solution? Freedom! Repeat as necessary until your opponent goes away. Nothing communists can be trusted unless somehow works in your favor, a la Khrushchev's secret speech from 1956 or anything Trotsky wrote. Communist leaders were paranoid for devoting so much time to security against counter-revolution, ignored the mountains of evidence, including the restoration of capitalism in the Eastern Bloc, that this threat was indeed real. Communist regimes were never popular. If proof is presented in various cases to show otherwise, claim that the people were brainwashed, make no effort to consider budgetary or logistical constraints on such an undertaking. Communist propaganda is crude and primitive. If someone mentions Red Dawn or worse, or mentions the J. Edgar Hoover-endorsed comic book series known as the Godless Communists, run away. Praise secularism in the name of freedom and pluralism until faced with the communists, then play the religion card. Atrocities and other bad things that happen under non-communist regimes are the fault of individual bad people. Anything bad that happens under a communist regime is the fault of the ideology and the system, and Stalin. Being an anti-communist means not having to have any sort of ideological consistency whatsoever. Preach populist left-wing pseudo-socialism 90% of the time, and then compare the capitalist system to Stalin's Russia. If you never really studied this subject, just read 1984 on Animal Farm. Bitch about capitalism 99% of the time, but balk when someone suggests communism as an alternative. Far right-wing fascist? Constantly bitch about cultural degeneracy under capitalism while remaining fanatically opposed to Marxism for no discernible reason save for your affinity of historical nationalism. If you're an anarchist, keep pointing out the failure of Marxism while ignoring the fact that your ideology has a 100% failure rate throughout the entire history. Blame those failures on communists or stronger military opponents. Ignore the fact that the most wonderful society is worthless if you can't defend it from reaction. Neo-Nazi? Communism is Jewish. Debate over. Neo-hippie? Tibet. Constantly condemn the genocide that allegedly occurred under Mao while ignoring the U.S.'s relation with China established by Nixon and the massive role capitalist China has played in the modern U.S. economy. When you want to talk positively about China, say it's a capitalist country. If you want to criticize it, it's still communist. Claim Marxism is not empirical. Neither are neoliberalism, democracy, freedom, but don't worry about that. Always insist that despite the location, country, historical era, past experience, and all other factors, communists must want to create a modern-day copy of Stalin's Russia, and that all that entails according to you. Do not notice the inherent idiocy of this concept, such as your particular country being already industrialized and not having a historical problem of severe backwardness. Learn to use magic word, totalitarian. This word allows you to link two ideological opposites, communism and fascism. Ignore the fact that socialist states experienced more economic problems parallel to the number of market reforms they made. When challenged about the numbers or historical context, resort to labels like ruthless tyrant, cruel murderer, and such. Remember, people like Stalin were mass murderers because of all the people they killed, and we know they killed all those people because they were mass murderers. It totally tracks.